I think part of the big problem is, again, the lack of economic growth. And yes, there was a recession in 2008, but in previous cycles, when there's been a recession, the steeper the recession, the quicker the bounce back. So I think the question has to be asked, why is there not a quicker bounce back this cycle? And if indeed spending government money, as we saw in the stimulus, and increasing taxes and all this regulations does not, actually helps economic growth, we should be having a boom economy. The average unemployment rate from the years 2000 to 2008 was 5.2%. We forget that. The unemployment rate went up to 10%, yes, it's dropped to 7.6, but it should be much lower. Again, if we take into account all the discouraged workers who have left. So it's really quite basic. I mean, those three factors in all the countries around the world have an impact, and they have a direct impact on job growth.
I want to talk a little bit about what jobs so we've gone through all of your ideas for how we create jobs. And I want to talk a little bit about what the jobs of the future look like and in where they are. I'm very self-interested. I have kids who are 9 and 12 years old, and I'm very personally interested.
I thought you were going to say because you're in journalism. So
that's my professional interest. My self-interest is what are the jobs that will be available to our children, and how are they different from the jobs today? There are a bunch of trends that we've spoken about a little bit. There's things like automation. There's the increased use of technology. At the same time, you actually have growth in jobs that are relatively low quality. Do you want to answer?
I would observe two things. The one thing that cannot really be answered is the one thing that everybody wants to know. Well, what is the job 40 years from now? What job will be the best paying job, and I want to have that job? And every economist will say, but we don't know. A lot of those jobs, if you go back 40 years in the census, if you ask now of the top 1/3 of paying occupation codes, what share of those occupation codes did not even exist in the census 40 years ago? It's a really high fraction. And so if you had said in 1910, how many people are going to have a telephone in 2013? They would say, no, that's totally impossible. Every man, woman, and child in America would have to be an operator pulling the cords out and sticking them in like this.
Yeah.
And yet, we invent technologies that eliminated essentially every telephone operator in America. But the unemployment rate in telecom did not go to 100% just because we came up with new technologies. We moved into these new things. So the good news is we have a 180-year track record of creating new jobs that 20 years later, everybody says, oh, we never thought of that, but now a lot of people do it. And two, the other good news is the government doesn't need to be relied on to figure it out. Business doesn't need to. It's in everybody's own incentive to go out and figure out what jobs are promising careers, and they're out doing it every day. When they go to school, they're trying to figure out what major to pick. They're trying to figure out what summer internships to get. So I think overall the trends that you see of higher skill equals higher pay and better performance in the job market is going to continue. You've seen a 60-plus year trend of more and more services-based employment in the U.S., and that will probably continue. But beyond that, I think it's harder to say.
Well, typical of the government, they actually do have a chart that tells all the jobs of the future. So, and I say this in support of what Austan is saying. Actually, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you're really interested, go on their website, and they have surveys and studies on predictions on what the jobs for the future are. They don't range into the next 40 years, but there's a list. And basically what we're seeing is a gap between higher skill jobs that require higher skilled labor. So for example, our country could have predominance in geospatial technology, in life sciences, in biotech, but we're lacking the requisite skilled workers to fill those jobs. And so, as Austan mentioned, we're gonna see continuously more and more of these new jobs that are being created. And I think there's any commonality, it would be that they're increasingly more complicated, more sophisticated, and they require higher skills, more education. And studies have shown, and you go on the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics website, the average weekly earning of someone who's a high school dropout is like, $456 a week. You contrast that weekly earnings, employment prospects, unemployment rates, overall earnings, there's no question that the higher educated individual will have better earnings, lower unemployment, better job prospects. And there's also one last thing I would mention. We do talk about this income gap. There is an income gap. This income gap comes from highly skilled workers and those who are relatively low skilled. Employers are willing to bid up the wages of those workers who have higher skills, and that's why their wages are increasing. So what we are seeing in terms of the income gap is really a manifestation of the education and training gap.